Okay, I think we can get started. Good evening to everyone. Welcome to our today's event organized jointly by the Institute for Bank- und Finanzgeschichte, IBF, and our Leibniz Institute, SAFE. My name is Walz. I'm a professor of economics at Goethe University, Frankfurt, and at the same time, I'm a bridge professor at SAFE, in which I'm responsible for our long-term research project on digitization of long-term financial and corporate data from the foundation of the German Empire to date. This project, which is financed by almost 2 decades by the Academien for Literature and the Sciences, is complemented by an intense research program in which we aim to undertake research on issues related to economic and financial history with this particular data. Not least against this background, I'm very happy to moderate today's event. Let me briefly take a couple of minutes to introduce our speakers today. First, we will hear from Tobias Straumann about his latest book, which you already see here in the title, which was published in October 2021 with Oxford University Press, on Out of Hitler's Shadow, Debt, Guilt, and the German Economic Miracle. This book, which is, in my reading, about how to win the peace after war, is obviously very topical these days. Tobias Straumann is a professor of modern and economic history at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and a lecturer of the Department of Economics at Zurich University, and the academic director of the Master of Advanced Studies in Applied History. At the same time, he is a member of the University of Zurich Center for Crisis Competence. His research is very broad, but concentrates on financial and monetary history, but also focuses on the history of Swiss multinational companies and the political economy of his home country, namely Switzerland. Furthermore, Tobias' interest lies in the interplay between economic crisis, institutional politics, including the 1931 debt crisis and its consequences on the rise of power of the Nazi regime. And this interplay is also the topic of one of his most recent books, and also of the book he will present today. Many thanks for your willingness to present today here your book, Tobias.
Thank you.
Our second speaker tonight is Rui Esteves, who will provide a discussion of the book presented. Rui Esteves is professor at the Leibniz Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. He focuses in his research on topics related also to financial history, particularly topics of international finance, institutional economics, and public finance in a historical perspective. Some of his work speaks also to the present day's process of international economic integration by studying the transformations brought about by the first war of globalization, which occurred pre-World War I. Rui has published intensively in the leading international journals in the field of economic history on quite a wide range of topics. Rui is very familiar to Frankfurt because he has held the visiting professorship for financial history at Goethe University in the House of Finance in 2025. It's great to have you, Rui, and after this short introduction, I open the floor and hand over to Tobias. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Uwe and Hannah, for the invitation and for the kind introduction. And thank you, Rui, for taking your time to read the book and provide some comments. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Let me briefly summarize the book. The starting point of the idea to write the book was to know more about the reconstruction of Western Europe. It's not a new topic. There was an intense and very stimulating debate on the economic consequences of the Marshall Plan and the European Payments Union during the 1980s, 1990s. Many eminent economic historians participated in this debate, and it was mainly about the question, was the Marshall Plan relevant or not? There were Abelshauser in Germany, or the English, Milward. They claimed that the Marshall Plan was irrelevant, that the recovery had begun already in 1947, and the Marshall Plan was basically just PR action of the United States government. And I think the consensus view was then that no, institutionally and psychologically, the Marshall Plan played a major role. It solved the collective action problem, which you always have when you start to liberalize after a war, and so forth and so on. So it's not new, but when I followed this discussion, I realized that there is an implicit assumption that the events after the year 1950 were irrelevant. The Marshall Plan was launched in 1948, the European Payments Union in 1950, so everything was set up. And when you look at the figures, the German economic miracle starts in the early 50s and continues without any interruption after. I was reinforced by this impression that the story ended a bit abruptly in 1950 by new research on the London Debt Agreement of 1953, and that's the main topic of my book. There is new research. There is a big habilitation thesis by a German scholar. There are several papers by economic historians. But my idea was to tell a narrative for a broader public, to tell them that the story is more complicated. It takes a longer amount of time, and especially the financial reconstruction that really starts only in 1950 and in the early 50s was just as important as all the steps taken before 1950. So in a way, I'm not coming up with a very original new view, but it's more comprehensive. And as I said, I'm trying to tell the story to a greater public. The public usually doesn't know about the London Debt Agreement, and the reason probably is because it worked quite well, at least economically. And my narrative is complementing cliometric research, for example, by Eichengreen and Ritschl, who compared the growth of the United Kingdom and the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1950s, and they also compared debt levels and fiscal policies, and I think the conclusion is clear that the high debt level of the UK was relevant, whereas for this slow growth in the 1950s was one factor, and the low debt of the Federal Republic of Germany was stimulating growth in the 1950s. And there is a newer paper by Galoff-Revia and others, and they clearly show that the London Debt Agreement had quite a substantial positive effect on the growth trajectory of the Federal Republic. What's maybe new is that I try to provide a typical historical account which shows how everything was related to everything else. So mainly what was not resolved in the early 50s was not only the issue of debt, but also of West German sovereignty and Western European security. And everything was linked to each other, and there were several negotiations in parallel, and they were linked together, and it was very, very difficult to find a solution for this complex situation. So that's maybe my contribution to provide a horizontal view, but everything else is not new, what I'm telling in the book. Okay, just to remind you, the main milestones of reconstruction of Western Europe, it's the currency reform in 48, followed by the Berlin airlift that probably everybody knows. Then, as I said, the Marshall Plan, it's called European Recovery Program, started in 48. It was announced in 47, the famous Harvard speech by Secretary of State Marshall. North Atlantic Treaty, it was not NATO, it was just NAT, because there was no organization yet. That comes later, also in the early 50s. and then the foundation of the two Germanys and the launch of the European Payments Union. And I'm complementing these very important milestones by two agreements. One is the London Debt Agreement. It's actually already fixed in August of 1952. That's the end of the London Debt Conference. It's ratified then by the US Senate in July 1953 as the last important parliament before it was ratified with UK, France, and West Germany. And the second important agreement is the Luxembourg Agreement that was between the Federal Republic of Germany, Israel, and the so-called Claims Conference. That was an umbrella organization of private Jewish foundations all over the world, especially in the United States. All right, so what are we talking about? What are the main elements of the London Debt Agreement and the Luxembourg Agreements? There are 5 points. First of all war-related reparations were postponed until reunification of Germany and the conclusion of a peace treaty. At the time, that was very unrealistic. So more or less, it meant there would never be any war-related reparations related to World War II to be paid by West Germany or by Germany. And as you know, in 1990, the four allies did not conclude a peace treaty with the reunited Germany, but a so-called 2+4 treaty in order to avoid a formal peace treaty and in order to avoid a reopening of the reparation negotiations. So at the time, that was unrealistic. So de facto, it was a cancellation of all reparation claims. And then private holders of German pre-war debt, especially holders of the Young Plan bonds or the Das Plan bonds, those reparation regimes by which Germany received a lot of foreign exchange to stabilize its finances and to stabilize the gold standard in 1924. They receive 44% of their claims back. So that's I mean, just looking at this, there is a tension between, the country is devastated, plundered by Nazi Germany, do not get anything, but private holders of pre-German debt receive almost 50% back. So there is a clear seniority and a clear priority of claims. And third, that's kind of uncontroversial. The US, UK, and France receive 58% of their post-war assistance, especially that was, of course, the Marshall Plan loans, but help started already earlier. So about 50%. And then additional, Israel receives 3 billion D-Mark, mostly in goods, and the Claims Conference receives 0.5 billion D-Mark. I will show you a bit later how you have to relate these figures to German GDP. But this is the thing, so no reparations, but everybody else gets something. And there is an exception regarding reparations, that's Israel and the Claims Conference, but that wasn't that much money actually. So it was a very good deal for West Germany. So here is the amount of debt relief. So you can, just for the illustration, the last column shows you the percentage that I just mentioned. So let's relate it to German finances. What you see clearly that when we look at GDP and we take the 3 columns at the right and we take the sum of them, it's really not a lot. It's less than 1% of GDP, of German GDP. So the yearly payments were very, very modest. So this is another sign or another a piece of evidence showing that the deal was very favorable to West Germany. And there is also this comparison to the so-called Lastenausgleich, the refugee compensation. As you may remember, there were about roughly 10 million Germans were expelled from Eastern European countries. They came to West Germany and they needed, of course, a lot of support, financial support, and this was much more than the yearly payments to the private holders of pre-war debt, to the countries having provided post-war assistance, and of course claims conference in Israel. So it was easy to pay for the German government. There were no huge burden for the fiscal policy. And here it's the relationship to the balance of trade and services. You may not know this, but in the late 40s, Germany still was running a deficit on trade and services. And it suffered from a very severe balance of payment crisis in late 1950, early 51. But then it turned and it became the so-called export Weltmeister. So it had a substantial surplus in its balance of trade and services. And so there was enough exchange reserves to transfer these debt payments. Contrary to the interwar years in the 1920s, Germany not only had fiscal problems to come up with the required reparation sum, but there were also shortages of exchange reserves to transfer it. That was the so-called transfer problem that many economists discussed in the 1920s. So there is no problem here in the early 50s to transfer all these debt payments. So taken together, a very generous deal, and one of the main topics of my book, or maybe the main topic of my book, is why were the United States, especially the United States, so generous, and how can we explain that you have this big gap between war-related reparations, nothing, and you still think of private holders of pre-war debt. They're obviously much more important to the United States government. As for the reparations, I think there is a clear answer. I think it's a case of learning from history. Some people say, well, the United States just did it because of the Cold War. That may be true. That doesn't explain the whole story, because the Cold War is just a kind of a structural constraint, but it doesn't tell you exactly what you have to do. And you still have choices. You can still punish Germany to a certain extent during the Cold War if you want. And when we look at the UK did not get a big debt reduction from the United States. So that's one argument against the people who emphasize the Cold War. Another argument would be that already in early 1946, there was the first reparation agreements where Germany had to pay some, also a small sum to all the Western countries. There, it was already kind of sketched what the London debt agreement would look like, and that the United States intended to not to punish Germany with high reparation claims. So, and that was before the Cold War really started. The Cold War started maybe in mid-46, but certainly in 47. But it was clearly before the Cold War was a clear constraining structure. So here is a citation by the Senator Alexander Wiley. He was the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations. He was responsible for ratifying the London Debt Agreement, and there were people who were complaining about the profits that went to these private holders of German pre-war debt. And he said there may be some persons who will profit by these agreements. But I believe the fact is clear that if we do not get Germany on her feet economically so that she can borrow money, we shall not only not get the billions of dollars, but we shall not get anything. So the Cold War is not explicit here, but it's a dilemma posed after Versailles, that if you punish, you don't get any money. If you don't punish, you get the money. And then another part of his speech. But as for myself, I do not believe now is the time for us to take a Versailles Treaty type of approach to Germany. So people were aware of the historical mistakes of the 1920s. One sure way to weaken the resistance of Germany to the pressures from the Soviet Union would be to demand our pound of flesh to make Germany pay in full and forget the consequences. Here you have the argument of the Cold War. It's also interesting that at the time, a US senator was referring to Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. Maybe that's really a thing of the past. And then he continues, one sure way to assure the defeat of democracy in Germany at the September elections would be to demand that Germany repay this country in full for post-war assistance, that's Marshall Plan and all that, whether she has the money or not. I point out that it was clearly established during the hearings that the total claims against Germany are absolutely beyond its capacity to pay. I'm not in favor of demanding the impossible. So there is some, as I say, Cold War rhetoric in there, but I think the reference to the Versailles Treaty is very clear. So I think it's really about learning from history. And I also try to show this in the book by describing the biographies of the main policymakers and diplomats. Most of them were born in the late 19th century. They had some memory of the First World War. Some of them even fought in the latter part of the First World War. And they were adults already in their professional life when they were observing how the post-war order after the First World War collapsed. And they clearly understood why it had collapsed. So this is more the horizontal aspect I mentioned on the first slide. It's really amazing. First, when they started to negotiate the three big issues, Western European security, West German sovereignty, and German debt and reparations, it was already quite complex. And my narrative follows these different negotiations, tensions, crises, and the interlinkages between these three things. So it's kind of a three-dimensional chess game. It started, but then when they started to negotiate in London, the start of the London debt conference was in February of 1952, all of a sudden the Israelis stepped in and it became a kind of a four-dimensional chess game. It became even more complicated because now it was not only about debt, security and sovereignty, but now it was also about guilt. And that's why I put it in the subtitle, Debt, Guilt and the German Economic Miracle. So all of a sudden it became a new dimension. And the idea that Germany does not have to pay any reparations to the countries plundered by Nazi Germany, they maintained this principle, but they had to make an exception. And it was very difficult to find a compromise with the Israelis and the claim conference representatives because everything depended on each other. Of course, if Israel got too many got too much money for the reparation claims, then that would change the whole dynamics of the London Debt Conference. And the Americans were actually, in a way, for reparations to Israel, but they feared that if Germany promised to pay a huge amount of reparations to Israel, then in the end, like after the First World War, the Americans would have to pay it through their post-war assistance. So it was very complicated and made it very hard to find a morally correct line. Just to provide some pictures, those are the main characters. It's President Truman. John McCloy was the High Commissioner of occupied Germany. He was kind of the proconsul. He was the most important policymaker in Germany until the so-called General Treaty, which gave the Germany more sovereignty, was concluded. And on the right hand, maybe the most important personality was Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Here you see the beginning of negotiations at the conference of the three Western allies. The foreign ministers met regularly. It's Ernest Bevin, UK, it's Dean Acheson and Robert Schuman, who was not a crucial figure directly, but by introducing the so-called Schuman Plan and the foundation of the European Community for Steel and Coal, um, um, he made an important integration step towards a final agreement between Germany and the Western Allies. And here's the signing of the Luxembourg Agreement. On the left-hand side, you see the Israeli Foreign Minister Sheret, and on the right-hand side you see Konrad Adenauer, not as Chancellor but as Foreign Minister. So the two foreign ministers met in Luxembourg. In the beginning, Chancellor Adenauer was also Foreign Minister. That was kind of convenient for him and probably also for the negotiations during this reconstruction period. He once said, all my ministers are useless except my foreign minister. So that's how he thought about his role. And that's the signing of the London Debt Agreement in February of 1953 by Hermann Josef Abs, who was the representative at the time. Here, by the way, you don't see him. Böhm was the chief negotiator of the German delegation. He is covered here on the picture. All right. A last point before I stop. I'm working on a paper together with a colleague on breakpoints during the negotiations. Those are the daily prices of German sovereign bonds, the DAS and the Young Plan. And when you go back to late 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was created, there was still very low expectations that eventually the holders of these bonds would be compensated. It changes in mid 1951 when the German delegation for the first time was welcomed by the kind of the chairman of the London Debt Conference. You see there is a clear increase from about 20 to 60. And then another clear steep rise in early of 1952. That's the beginning of the London Debt Conference. Then you see there is a big crisis in June, July, and then the end of the London Debt Conference in August. That marks really the breakthrough. But then again, people are kind of mistrustful because of the problems of ratification. But after the US Senate ratified, you see that there is a big rally, and we could say that the period of financial reconstruction has ended in mid 1953. So let me conclude to remind you again what the book is all about. It's about the story, it's about reconstruction of Western Europe. It was not completed until 1953, 54. The financial reconstruction was crucial. It's kind of interesting that, you know, the historiography on the 1920s is focused heavily on the financial reconstruction, as for the period after World War II, it kind of disappeared. It re-emerged in the early 2000s, but it kind of disappeared. And maybe a point for the discussion, I think the deal was economically smart. I think the United States government, that was a good decision to, you know, to cancel reparation claims. But we have to be careful. It's not just a linear success story. There were losers, and I would say that the agreements were neither fair nor just. But that's how history works. Sometimes you have really tough trade-offs, and I have to admire the decisions taken by the people at the time, because of course, they knew what they were doing. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Tobias, for this very concise but informative presentation of the main elements of your book. And may I hand over to you, Rui, to briefly discuss the main points or the book overall.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be back to SAFE and the Leibniz Institute, if only virtually. And I also want to start with the obvious, which is to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this book. It's always a pleasure to read Tobias's work, and I'm sure that this book in particular will become a reference on the origins of the grand bargain that settled World War II in Europe and ushered Germany's Wirtschaftswunder and the Trente Glorieuses years of growth in Western Europe. Now, on top of this, Tobias made something that is very rare in the sense that he wrote a book that, though grounded on impressive archival work, is never fastidious. In fact, it has all the ingredients of a classical, fast-paced political drama. It has multiple layers of conflict, public, institutional, and personal, permeated by information asymmetry, acted out in closed rooms and in public arenas, and escalating into a resolution made of trade-offs rather than clean victory. It's actually a page-turner, and I count it as the best book I have read so far this year. So thanks again. Now, I'm not going to summarize the book again because I think Tobias did a very good job. I'm going to raise 3 points or comments that are based on my own curiosity about some of the strands that are raised in the plot. So the first one has to do with the debt agreement itself, right? So Tobias correctly points out that the London Debt Agreement has been unjustly forgotten in the historiography of the early reconstruction and growth after World War II. And the book explains quite well how the debt agreement was dependent on a number of other contemporary negotiations, the four-side game of chess that Tobias just mentioned. Those being the settlement of Israeli claims, the creation or the attempted creation of an European defense community, and the general treaty that gave back sovereignty to the Federal Republic towards a grand bargain where each of these elements was dependent on the others. However, the book is a bit less detailed about the unfolding of the negotiations in London itself, all the way to the final debt write-down. The book only refers to Hermann Abs being asked to state the amount that Germany, or the maximum amount that Germany could pay, subject to the famous transfer problem. But it gives not much detail on the macro and public finance assumptions or forecasts with which Abs justified the amount. It actually gives the impression that negotiations were a sequence of 2 take-it-or-leave-it offers made by Abs and negotiated to the end. So in particular, I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about Hermann Abs' own role in the negotiations. Creditors don't usually settle for what the debtor states to be the maximum amount it can pay, as in this case. So how did the Assembly of Creditors in London weigh in Abs' arguments against their own information about the Federal Republic's ability to pay? Now, in an earlier event in this unfolding story in the early 1950s, the occupying powers had sent 2 economists on a fact-finding mission to Germany, those being Alec Cairncross and Pierre Jacobsen, to investigate the state of German external accounts. Did they do the same during the debt negotiations? Did they try to collect their own information on Germany's fiscal capacity, or did they just trust Abs? I think this would be interesting for the record. Now, a second question is about the sequencing and the number of parties to each agreement. Tobias correctly pointed out that adding more elements into the negotiation and more parties made it apparently more complicated to reach the grand bargain that would settle everything. In particular, he discusses, or he shows very well, how German politicians, namely Abs and other ministers, reacted negatively to the intromission, so-called, of the government of Israel into the financial negotiations of the end of the war, because they thought that this would make it harder to reach a settlement with creditors in London. However, we can consider this multiplicity of games of chess, as it were, from a different perspective. Actually, bargaining theory would say that the Federal Republic's position would be reinforced by having to deal with more parties. By my count, at least 6. So you had the US, Britain, France, Israel, the representatives of US creditors, and the representatives of non-US creditors. Now, this generated a multiplicity of issues that could have allowed for a greater scope for compromise in each of them. So, for instance, Israel had to limit its claims to what it thought the US would accept. The US then was constrained by, or was trying to constrain its private creditors to its strategic aim for Europe and the Cold War overall. The French and the British governments also had to do the same, namely because they had an interest in cooperating with the US, which was then the supplier of Marshall funds and, of course, the agenda center in terms of post-war multilateralism. In contrast, the Federal Republic had one aim: regaining full sovereignty within the Western Bloc at the least financial cost. So it's unclear to me that actually the Federal Republic's bargaining position didn't end up being reinforced by this multiplicity of different claims and different agents with which it interacted in a fairly short period of time. There's also perhaps a question of sequencing, as earlier settlements could have conditioned the bargaining set for later ones. So I just observed that the European Defence Community and the General Treaty were the first to be settled in May 1952 against Luxembourg and the London Debt Agreement, which were settled later in the year or ratified early in 1953. To me, this sequence doesn't appear accidental and reveals the importance of, or the greater importance of geopolitics over financial claims. Which then leads me to my third and final observation, which is whether there are implications, historical implications of the London Debt Agreement for the settlement of the debt burdens of many nations since. Tobias does mention this in the conclusion of the book. He didn't in the presentation. So let me replace myself a little bit to him and mention this point. Now, with 2020 hindsight, we know that Germany quickly became a miracle of economic growth and export prowess. Others, mentioned by Tobias, have argued that the generosity of the creditors in 1952-53 was key for this outcome. It directly by creating fiscal space for investment and social spending, namely debt deferring from the law of equality of burdens, the Lastenausgleichsgesetz, but also for investment in social housing and so on. But also indirectly by making inflation stabilization possible. So the comparison with the European victors, namely France and the UK, we exited the war with considerably higher debts and so had greater trouble controlling their own inflation processes is also tempting. But to me, at least, I seem to think that the regaining access to external investment capital and the complementarity between German heavy industry and the demand for capital goods in the rest of Europe were more important for German economic recovery than the simple accounting write-down of its debt overhang. Now, but the London Debt Agreement has also been invoked as an example of a fairer or more sustainable debt forgiveness compared to the practice of the debt agreements for developing nations since the war, as practiced by the Bretton Woods institutions. Now, the very last bullet point you saw in Tobias' presentation was to say that it was a successful deal, but not a fair or a just one. But actually, it's funny because authors arguing for a more lenient or fairer treatment of developing nations today by creditor nations and, the Bretton Woods institutions actually cite the London Debt Agreement as an example to emulate. So, justice or fairness can be measured two different ways. Now, we all know that the German debt settlement and the London Debt Agreement has also been used in more recent comparisons with the 3 bailouts of Greece and the alleged German intransigence to offer more generous terms. But leaving aside the thorny issue of post-war reparations, which, as Tobias reminded us were just cancelled in practice, the London Debt Agreement is indeed, or appears indeed, generous on the generous side of post-war debt forgiveness. So it was worth about 22% of German GDP, which sits it above the mean debt write-downs, both in the post-war practice. So the data for debt cancellations of high-income emergent market economies between the late 1970s and 2010 is on average 15.7%, so 22 is above that. But it's also interestingly higher than the average debt write-downs in the interwar, namely the 1934 debt agreement after the Hoover moratorium of 1931, and that average was 17.6. So on those grounds, the London Debt Agreement was indeed more generous, but there were actually many other more generous settlements, both in the interwar and after World War II. But many of these settlements, what they didn't have is the geopolitical considerations that were associated with the German debt settlement. Similarly, the ability to pay is not an exact quantity, and pre-settlement forecasts often fail after the fact. In the German case, I think it's fair to say that forecasts were too pessimistic, but perhaps the international financial institutions since have been guilty of excessive optimism about countries' ability to grow out of their debt and of endorsing unrealistic debt reductions that end up leading to repeated debt crises and ongoing dependence of developing nations on multilateral support. So yet again, the parallel with the relative generosity and the relative pessimism of the London Debt Agreement rings true. Now, old-style TV crime dramas usually have an epilogue where the main characters are reunited a while after the event. It's interesting that the same is true of the German debt settlement. In 1969, Hermann Abs, the representative of Germany in the London Debt Agreement, was actually called to mediate on the settlement of the debts of another nation, in this case, Indonesia, after the coup that had ousted Sukarno. This was a geopolitical sensitive arrangement because Indonesia owned large debts to the two sides of the Iron Curtain, the Western and the Eastern Bloc. Now, Abs was appointed for his considerable knowledge of public finance and because both sides trusted his honorability and independence. And what's interesting is that he proposed a remarkably similar debt settlement to the London Agreement, resulting in a debt write-down of 53%, just 1% above the German one, which was to be equally distributed across classes of creditors. This was based on, I guess, what we can call the Abs doctrine of capping debt payments to the country's ability to pay, as determined by its balance of payments, or as people used to call it in the interwar, the transfer problem. But it also depended on the special characteristics that Abs highlighted in the report he wrote in 1959, and again, which are very similar to the Germany's own characteristics. And these were: the inherited debt had been incurred by a previous government, perhaps odious, and had not been incurred with a productive sense. The country could clearly not repay its debt in the future. Macro stabilization, especially controlling inflation, depended on the fiscal space and on outside support. And perhaps more importantly than all of the above, the US was very interested in stabilizing the new right-wing regime led by Suharto. So I conclude by stating that debt agreements are clearly not created alike, and that the book by Tobias Straumann is a fitting example of how the role of geopolitics in international finance is frequently forgotten, even within what we came to call a multilateral system as inaugurated by the Bretton Woods institutions after 1945. So thanks again for the invitation, and thanks, Tobias, for writing this book.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Rui, for this nice discussion and insightful discussion. Maybe, Tobias, you want to get back or respond quickly to some points?
Yeah, if I can, very good points, very interesting. The reason I did not go into more detail regarding the negotiations at London is that they they're very technical, and I was always reflecting on that. How many details can I introduce to a historical narrative that should be a page turner? So maybe I left a bit too much away, but what I can say is that the Allies, regarding the first point, the Allies knew exactly what they were doing. They were very well informed about German finances. And the first meeting in the spring of 1951 between the German delegation and the chairman of the London Debt Conference was only about all these different debt categories. And the Germans presented some figures, but then they had to go back and clarify a lot of them. And it took weeks or even months to come up with a clear picture of especially of the pre-war debt. So I think the Allies knew very well what UPS was doing, but UPS was very, I would say, was kind of aggressive in his negotiation strategy. But when there was pushback, he was very flexible. That was kind of his strategy, and he was never moral. While some German politicians were always a bit morally, obnoxious people, because they always thought if the Allies did not follow what the Germans wanted, it was kind of the old game, like after Versailles. And I think the big flexibility of UPS was absolutely crucial to find a good compromise. I show that UPS was really, pursuing a hard line, and there was really a big crisis in May of 1952. And then the Allies pushed back, and then he had to follow the Allies. So that's one reason I didn't talk that much, but that's a very good point. It's very interesting for economic historians to find out more about the strategies and the information the people had at the time. The second point, it's absolutely true. I don't want to comment too much on that, but just one information is that actually all the agreements are kind of clarified within almost a few hours in May of 1952. Of course, first there was the signing of the General Treaty and the European Defense Community Treaty, but actually, and Luxembourg and the London Debt Conference were later. But it's amazing how within 1 or 2 days everything was clarified in May of 1952. So we have to be careful about the sequence of events. I think the contemporaneous logic is a bit stronger than the signing of the agreements implies. And the last point is really interesting. I'm not going to comment on that. I didn't know that. And your last point about Indonesia is just marvelous. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple more minutes left, and I would like to invite the audience to ask questions to our two speakers. Maybe I come up with one, which goes back to what we are doing with the data I just mentioned at the very beginning. As you mentioned in your book, there were basically very little, if no, monetary reparations, but there were some reparations in kind, in particular patent repatriations and so on. Do you know of any evidence on the micro effects of these reparations?
You mean the reparations to Israel? They were,
but also the US, basically, this project Paperclip, which basically meant that the US went through the western parts of Germany and basically expropriated some kind of IP rights from the companies.
Well, I'm not familiar with this research in detail. Maybe Rui knows more about it, but I think that the United States profited a lot from this intellectual property and from the service of former Nazi engineers and scientists, and also, of course, profited enormously by by the German Jewish scientists, who had left the country before the Holocaust. I think, and there are calculations. There is a book by Jörg Fisch. He tried to assemble all the data, but still, it's substantial, but it's not a huge sum if you try to monetize the contribution. And actually, the removal of industrial capacities that stopped quite early, and it never reached a huge amount of removal because the Allies realized that it was not very good for their reputation if they removed. And there, I think the evidence is quite clear that it's not easy to remove a plant and then resettle and start production from scratch because you need the people. The Soviets removed much more, but they didn't profit a lot from that. So there is research on that, and I think again, first part, yes, you're right. That was substantial, but it was still not an amount of that would have changed the whole equation.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think that the greatest loss to Germany science and productivity probably happened in the 30s with the exodus of Jewish scientists and Jewish academics, right? So the work of Fabian Waldinger and Petra Moser shows that there was a very strong connection between the growth of US science and productivity after the war to that exodus.
Okay, so let me go back to the audience. Any questions, any issues you want to raise? Okay,
well, I can raise another one.
Yeah, it seems that you did a great job in explaining all the matters, but maybe you want to take over.
I mean, the topic that both of us left, right, is the question of reparation, right, and how they interacted, right? So you said that in the end, the process, the settlement was not fair or just. Fairness and justice are not exactly the same. So would you want to elaborate a little bit?
Oh, well, yeah, very good. Well, maybe I use two words to think about the same thing. I wanted to say just maybe more in a legal sense, and fair more in a moral sense. It's a harsh judgment, but I really want to write against a kind of a linear success story, and I want to remind the people that it's maybe trivial, but that even at the high point of multilateralism and at the high point of transatlantic relationships, and the US at the time played a completely different role than today. Even at that time, we shouldn't be too romantic about the choices made by the superpower. That's mainly my point. And to remind the people that they really made a clear difference between different types of claims. And I do not agree totally with your assessment of that the private holders of pre-German debt were kind of integrated in the, how did you say it? Integrated in the foreign policy of the United States. I think that the fact that the private holders received 44% of their claims shows that they were in a very strong position. So I think that because in the beginning, when you look at the prices of the DOS and the Young bonds, the expectation was they would not get anything. And in the end, they got almost 50%. So I think, and I describe it in the book, that at the end, they boycotted the private bondholder organizations, boycotted the whole process in London. They caused a huge crisis. And then the Secretary of State made a compromise that was very favorable to these private bondholders. So they were in a really strong position, I think. And And that makes it kind of hard to accept that the countries, really plundered by Nazi Germany didn't get much, but the private bondholders, they get 50%. Even after, I mean, at the end of the war, you find people who said they will never get the money back. We have absolutely other priorities at the moment. We cannot afford to pay them. And in the end, they get a lot. So that maybe another short remark on what you said about pessimism. That's really interesting. I cite a few newspaper articles which were written at the time of the ratification of the London Debt Agreement, and they were very pessimistic. So you're right. It's what I said is hindsight. At the time, people thought it's maybe could be too high. The burden could be too high because they didn't know at the time whether this trade surplus would be sustainable, whether the growth trajectory would be continued. So you're absolutely right. I find a lot of people who said that. But after a year already, the assessment was changing. People were getting more optimistic. But that's really helpful how you compare it with other debt settlements. I wasn't aware of that.
Okay, there is, in the end, one question. I just read the table you have shown us only mentioned inter-allied reconstruction debt, not war ones. I think I'm curious about tensions between the Western powers and the link between the German debt agreement and all the inter-allied war debts that were such an issue in the 20s and 30s. Was that already resolved by that time?
Yes, thanks, Guillaume. I think it was resolved. Maybe Rui can step in. Yes, you have this the Lausanne Agreement in 1932, where all war-related debts were kind of cancelled. So that was in 32. That was shortly after Brüning was dismissed. The macroeconomic regime changes as a result of the cancellation of these reparation claims and the war-related debts between the Allies. And it already starts, of course, with the Hoover moratorium in June of 1931. What's important is the 1946 Anglo-American loan. I don't know about the details, how much debt, interwar debt they were integrating, but I'm not sure about that. But in any case, Britain didn't get a huge debt relief after World War II, but it could be probably that the interwar debts were already cancelled at that time. I think maybe Rui knows more about it.
Yeah. They were cancelled in 34. Yes.
Oh, that's the one you mentioned before. Yes. Okay.
Okay, so we are almost at the end. We have a clear-cut end line, so it's 7:30. So I would like to once again thank the speaker, also the audience for participating in this very encouraging and very insightful exchange between Tobias and Rui. And I think we can take quite a bit out of that. And thanks again for organizing the whole session to IBF and SAFE. Have a nice evening, and I hope to see you digitally or in person soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Uwe. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.